What stands out immediately when examining the history of paleoanthropology is not simply that ideas changed, but that certain ideas were buried even after the evidence supporting them became overwhelming. In 1944, long before genetic sequencing, long before ancient DNA laboratories, and long before anyone had extracted a single Neanderthal genome, evolutionary geneticist Theodosius Dobzhansky arrived at a conclusion that now feels astonishingly modern. Looking at the fossils from Mount Carmel in the Levant, especially the extraordinary skeletons from School and Tabun, he stated plainly that there was no reason to imagine multiple completely separate human species existing side by side during the Ice Age. In his view, Neanderthals and modern humans represented interconnected populations within the same evolving human network. Indeed, the words that Dobzhansky wrote should have transformed the field of human evolutionary studies. On the basis of the available data, there is no reason to suppose that more than a single hominid species has existed on any time level in the Pleistocene. Particularly, the findings on Mount Carmel prove that the Neanderthal and modern types were populations of the same species rather than distinct species. At the time, this conclusion emerged directly from anatomy. The Mount Carmel fossils did not behave the way a clean replacement model required. They refused to fit into tidy boxes. Some skulls carried projecting faces and strong brow ridges reminiscent of Neanderthals, yet also possessed rounded cranial vaults, reduced prognathism, and chins associated with Homo sapiens. Others looked modern from one angle and archaic from another. Theodore McCown, who worked directly with these fossils during the excavations under Dorothy Garrod, understood immediately that the Levant represented a biological frontier where populations overlapped and mixed. The fossils looked transitional because they were transitional. They looked blended because they were blended. What makes this historical episode so extraordinary is that the core insight turned out to be correct, not partially correct, not vaguely suggestive. Correct in principle decades before genetics finally proved it. Yet rather than becoming the foundation for future research, the hybridization model was gradually pushed aside during the rise of the strict replacement interpretation that dominated the late 20th century. As the out-of-Africa model hardened into dogma, the Mount Carmel fossils became deeply inconvenient. Their anatomy disrupted the simplicity of the narrative. They showed overlap where the theory required separation. They showed continuity where the theory demanded extinction. And so a new interpretation emerged in which School and Kafza became failed migrations, temporary African visitors who entered the Levant around 120,000 years ago before disappearing completely, supposedly replaced later by a second and successful expansion around 60,000 years ago. Something about this interpretation always felt artificial. The fossils themselves never behaved like the bones of a vanished side branch. School 5 in particular looked uncannily connected to later Eurasian populations. The skull possessed a large cranial capacity, a high forehead, and clear modern tendencies, yet also carried the robust architecture of older Western Eurasian populations. The face remained powerful. The brow ridges retained strength. The cranial vault still carried thickness uncommon in later Europeans. These were not the traits of a pristine and newly emerged, fully modern population entering Eurasia for the first time. They looked instead like the anatomy of people already shaped by a long regional history. Even in the 1980s, this tension had become impossible for some scholars to ignore. German anthropologist Gunther Brauer proposed what he openly described as a hybridization and replacement model, a concept that acknowledged that expanding Homo sapiens populations interbred with existing archaic populations rather than simply exterminating or replacing them outright. The remarkable thing is that Brauer was essentially rediscovering the logic already visible in McCown and Dobzhansky's earlier work. The Levantine fossils already pointed in this direction. The anatomy already revealed mixture. Yet the atmosphere within paleoanthropology during the 1980s increasingly favored a more rigid ideological structure built around separation, purity, and complete replacement. In the 1980s, many archaeologists believed that the finds represented a species in transition from Neanderthal to Cro-Magnon, that they were a hybrid population, or that Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were in the process of merging to form a single race. However, at the same time, Dr. Chris Stringer himself called for Neanderthals to be recognized as a separate species that evolved in parallel with modern humans before disappearing. This is why the phrase "out of Africa cult" or "out of Africa mafia" emerged among critics. Harsh language, perhaps, but understandable when viewed historically. The problem was never the idea that Africa played a major role in human origins. Africa clearly did. The problem was the insistence that all contrary evidence had to be bent into a single rigid framework, no matter how awkward the fit became. Fossils that showed continuity across Eurasia became failed migrations. Fossils with mixed anatomy became statistical noise. Early Levantine populations became evolutionary ghosts, who somehow contributed nothing to later humanity, despite living precisely in the corridor connecting Africa, Europe, and Western Asia. Then genetics arrived, and slowly the old certainty began to fracture. The discovery of Neanderthal DNA inside living non-African populations detonated the original replacement model almost instantly. Suddenly, the supposedly absolute species boundary collapsed. Interbreeding was no longer speculation. It was measurable biological reality. Yet even then, the older orthodoxy did not disappear entirely. Instead, the narrative adjusted itself. Interbreeding was acknowledged but minimized. A small and isolated event, limited admixture, a footnote rather than a central process, but the fossils continued to resist simplification. The discovery of Manot Cave in Israel became one of the most important turning points in this entire debate. Dated to roughly 55,000 years ago, the Manot skull appeared at exactly the right place and exactly the right time to illuminate the contact zone between Neanderthals and early Upper Paleolithic humans. The skull itself was unmistakably modern in overall structure, yet possessed subtle anatomical tendencies long associated with Neanderthals. The occipital region projected backward into a bun-like contour. The cranial rear displayed a suprainiac depression. The vault proportions echoed later Upper Paleolithic Europeans while still retaining traces of older Western Eurasian morphology. And then came the comparison that changed everything. Researchers immediately noticed the striking similarity between Manot and the famous skulls from Mladic in Moravia. These Central European fossils, associated with the Aurignacian culture roughly 40,000 years ago, had always occupied an uncomfortable place within the replacement narrative. They were supposed to represent modern humans entering Europe after Neanderthals vanished, yet their anatomy looked anything but cleanly separate. Mladic 5 in particular possessed a long cranial vault, robust facial structure, thick bone and cranial contours that echoed Neanderthal populations while remaining fundamentally Homo sapiens. For decades, scholars argued over what these similarities meant. Were they merely superficial, convergent evolution, statistical coincidence, or did they reveal something deeper and far more important? The Manot-Mladic comparison suddenly made the older hybridization models look prophetic. These fossils no longer appeared as disconnected curiosities scattered across Eurasia. They began to look like members of a long-standing Western Eurasian population network stretching from the Levant into Europe itself. A population shaped not through sudden replacement, but through prolonged interaction, continuity, climatic isolation, and repeated gene exchange. The implications were immense. If Manot connects morphologically to Mladic, and if Manot itself already carries traces associated with Neanderthal ancestry before the expansion into Europe, then the entire old framework begins to collapse. The simplistic story of fully modern Africans entering Europe and then briefly mixing with Neanderthals before replacing them becomes inadequate. The admixture process was already underway before Europe was fully colonized. The Levant itself functioned as a deep hybrid zone, and suddenly the old Mount Carmel fossils looked entirely different. Skul and Kafsa no longer resembled failed experiments. They resembled ancestral populations within the same broader Western Eurasian continuum. Their mixture of archaic and modern traits no longer required elaborate excuses. Their anatomy fit perfectly into a model of prolonged regional continuity with repeated interaction among neighboring populations. This is precisely why Dobzhansky's statement from 1944 now feels so astonishingly ahead of its time. He recognized something fundamental that later theoretical fashions tried to erase. Human evolution was not a sequence of perfectly isolated species replacing one another like actors exiting a stage. It was messy, interconnected, regional, dynamic. Populations met repeatedly. They exchanged genes repeatedly. They adapted locally while still remaining biologically connected. The tragedy is that paleoanthropology spent much of the late 20th century moving away from this complexity rather than toward it. The strict replacement framework simplified human evolution into something almost mythological: one origin, one expansion, one victorious lineage. The deeper regional history of Eurasia became minimized or dismissed. Fossils that contradicted the model became awkward anomalies. Even obvious continuity between Levantine and European populations was often treated cautiously because it threatened the neat architecture of total replacement. In hindsight, this intellectual narrowing probably delayed the field by 40 years. That statement sounds severe until one considers the actual timeline. McCown and Dobzhansky recognized the importance of hybridization before the middle of the 20th century. Brouwer attempted to revive a similar framework during the 1980s. Yet only after ancient DNA forced the issue did the broader discipline begin returning to ideas that earlier scholars had already recognized through anatomy alone. The irony is almost painful. The old morphologists, working only with calipers, comparative anatomy and fossil observation, often understood the biological picture more accurately than later theorists armed with computers but constrained by rigid ideological assumptions. McCown looked directly at the Mount Carmel skeletons and saw blending. Dobzhansky looked at the same evidence and rejected strict species separation. Brouwer recognized that replacement without hybridization simply did not fit the anatomy. And now genetics has carried the field back toward their position. Today, even many mainstream researchers openly acknowledge that the earliest Upper Paleolithic Europeans carried much higher Neanderthal ancestry than living Europeans. The Oasi individual from Romania possessed a Neanderthal ancestor only a few generations earlier. Meladic populations display mixed morphology consistent with deep interaction. Levantine Neanderthals themselves often appear less specialized and less extreme than Western European Neanderthals, suggesting prolonged contact zones rather than isolated populations. The old binary categories begin dissolving everywhere one looks. Even the terminology itself becomes unstable. Neanderthal, modern human, archaic. These labels begin to blur once real population dynamics are reconstructed across hundreds of thousands of years. Western Eurasia increasingly resembles a shifting metapopulation structure rather than a battlefield between perfectly distinct species. The Levant stands at the center of this realization. Not a temporary migration corridor, not a failed detour, a long-occupied biological crossroads where human populations repeatedly interacted across immense spans of time. Skul, Kafse, Tabun, Manot, and eventually Maladek all begin aligning into a coherent evolutionary picture once the assumption of total replacement is abandoned. And this changes the emotional tone of the human story itself. Human evolution no longer appears as a sequence of pure populations erasing one another in clean succession. Instead, it becomes a story of persistence, adaptation, intermarriage, survival, and continuity across landscapes repeatedly reshaped by climate and migration. The people of Skul were not evolutionary ghosts. They were part of the ancestry of later Eurasian populations. The mixed anatomy of Maladek is not confusion. It is memory preserved in bone. What emerges now is not the destruction of African origins, but the destruction of simplistic origins. Africa mattered enormously. Eurasia mattered enormously. The Levant mattered enormously. Human evolution happened across interconnected regions linked by repeated movement and repeated contact. The old replacement model attempted to compress this vast complexity into a clean and emotionally satisfying story. But reality turned out far stranger and far more fascinating, and perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. The fossils themselves never changed. Skul did not suddenly grow a different brow ridge. Kafse did not suddenly lose its archaic anatomy. Mladek did not suddenly acquire Neanderthal traits after the invention of ancient DNA. The evidence sat in museum drawers and excavation reports for nearly a century, while the interpretation around it shifted with intellectual fashion. Entire generations of students were taught that the Levantine fossils represented evolutionary failures, temporary expansions that vanished without consequence, despite the obvious anatomical continuity staring directly back from the bones themselves. The field spent decades constructing elaborate explanations for why these populations supposedly disappeared completely, when the simpler explanation was already visible from the beginning. They did not disappear. They survived, mixed, adapted, and contributed to the ancestry of later Eurasian populations. What makes this historical episode so important is not merely that one theory replaced another. Science evolves constantly. The deeper issue is how rigid frameworks can narrow interpretation so severely that even obvious evidence becomes difficult to see. Once the replacement narrative became dominant, every fossil was filtered through it automatically. Any skull with mixed anatomy became a problem to explain away rather than a clue pointing toward continuity. Every Levantine population had to be categorized either as fully modern or fully archaic, even when the fossils themselves clearly occupied the territory between those categories. The complexity of human evolution became compressed into a simple morality tale of emergence and extinction. Now the older picture is returning piece by piece. Genetics confirms interbreeding. Morphology confirms continuity. The LEVANT confirms long-term interaction zones. Manot confirms that populations carrying mixed ancestry already existed before the expansion into Europe. Mladek confirms that the earliest Europeans still carried visible traces of this blended ancestry in their skulls themselves. And suddenly the work of McCown, Dobzhansky, and later Gunther Brauer no longer looks outdated. It looks remarkably modern. This reversal should force a moment of humility within paleoanthropology. The field often presents itself as marching steadily towards truth, yet the history of the replacement model reveals something far more complicated. Sometimes entire disciplines become captivated by elegant simplicity. Sometimes theories become socially reinforced long before the evidence truly justifies certainty. Sometimes younger scholars inherit narratives so powerful that questioning them becomes professionally uncomfortable. And sometimes the fossils wait patiently for decades until technology catches up with what anatomy had already implied. The real human story emerging now is far more fascinating than the older replacement myth ever allowed. Ice Age humanity was not composed of isolated species marching toward inevitable extinction one after another. Eurasia appears increasingly like a connected human landscape, populated by neighboring groups exchanging genes, adapting locally, fragmenting during harsh climatic phases, and reconnecting again when environments shifted. The boundaries between populations existed, but they were porous. Human evolution was not a clean line. It was a braided system of ancestry, stretching across continents and through immense spans of time. And this realization changes how we look at ourselves. The old replacement narrative encouraged people to imagine human history as a sequence of pure populations, each replacing the last in a clean evolutionary progression. But the deeper truth emerging from both fossils and genetics is almost the opposite. Modern humanity exists precisely because populations mixed. Survival came through interaction, not isolation. The people who lived at Skul, Kafse, Manot and Mladek were not failed branches standing outside our ancestry. They were part of the process that created the modern world. Even the emotional symbolism of the LEVANT changes under this interpretation. For decades, it was portrayed merely as a corridor, a temporary route between Africa and Europe. Now it increasingly appears as one of the central evolutionary theatres of the human story itself, a place where populations met repeatedly across hundreds of thousands of years, where archaic and modern traits merged, where the foundations of later Eurasian humanity were formed long before the Upper Paleolithic explosion in Europe. And perhaps that is why the Mount Carmel fossils continue to feel so powerful nearly a century after their excavation. They expose how artificial many later categories became. They reveal that human evolution never behaved according to the tidy boundaries imposed upon it. The people buried in those caves were already telling us that the story was one of overlap, continuity, and mixture. They were already showing us that the separation between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens was never absolute. The most remarkable part is that the scholars who first handled those bones understood this without genetics, without sequencing machines, and without modern computational models. They trusted anatomy. They trusted morphology. They trusted what the fossils themselves were showing them. In the end, the bones turned out to be more honest than the theories built around them. And now, after nearly a century of argument, reinterpretation and resistance, the field is slowly circling back towards a conclusion that was already visible in 1944. Human evolution was not driven by clean replacement. It was driven by continuity, contact, adaptation, and hybridization across a vast interconnected world. The replacement theory did not simply oversimplify the human story. It delayed the recognition of its true complexity for nearly half a century. The fossils waited patiently through all of it, through every debate, every paradigm shift, every declaration of certainty. And now, as Manot and Meladek reconnect the Levant to Upper Paleolithic Europe, those old skeletons from Mount Carmel finally appear less like anomalies and more like witnesses. Witnesses to a deeper human story that science is only now beginning to fully recover. Thank you for watching. If this story changes the way you think about human origins, about Neanderthals, or about the ancient people who once lived between Africa and Eurasia, consider subscribing and joining us for future explorations into the forgotten corners of paleoanthropology and ancient history. Because the deeper researchers dig into the human past, the stranger and more interconnected the story becomes. And increasingly, the biggest discoveries are not entirely new fossils, but the realization that some of the most important evidence was sitting in front of us all along,